My name's Gavin Thompson, for those who don't know me, and I'm one of the partners of Bureau Happold, and welcome to Bureau Happold this evening for our guests. We are in the process of launching today and tomorrow our C-Lab program, which is an urban research group within Bureau Happold. It's exploring the space where the physical things that we design, the systems, meet the people that occupy them or use them, and how that affects behaviours. And we're really interested in that because we want to explore the areas of emergence in that space, and we want to do that with our friends and collaborators. And we have a number of our brightest and best people from across the practice who come together today and tomorrow in Bath to explore that topic. They're members of our C-Lab pilot group, and we are in the process of setting our agenda. And I've been told not to gush about it, but I am really excited about it. But one of the key things about the programme is that we don't want to be introverted about it. We want to go on this journey together with a number of our valued collaborators. And Reinier, who's kindly agreed to give this talk this evening, is one of those valued collaborators, as there are a number of people in the audience. And Reinier is going to be working with our group, together with Lorraine, who you'll see more of later this evening, with our group tomorrow morning. I'm not going to get into framing what Reinier is going to talk about, but just to introduce Reinier. Reinier is, for those of you who don't know him, you should. He's a partner of OMA and a founder of AMO, part of OMA. And I was thinking how best I could describe Reinier to those of you who perhaps don't know him too well. In my experience, Reinier is very good, exceptionally good, at holding a mirror up to things and reflecting back what he sees. He's held that mirror up to us, which at times can be quite challenging, especially when it's in pin-sharp reveal. He's held that mirror up to OMA's clients and explored what they see in themselves, in the agenda that they're setting, in the brief that they're setting, their aspirations for projects. He's held that up against cities and strategies and exploring whether they're appropriate. And I think what's fascinating is Reinier also holds that mirror up to himself and tells us about it through various talks, papers, and also his book, Four Walls and a Roof.
Thank you very much for the very flattering introduction. The mirror, indeed, I'm going to be holding up tonight is to myself, or more precisely, to the profession I guess I represent. I'm an architect, and I think architecture is in many ways in more trouble than it cares to admit. The title of my lecture is Where From Here, with a question mark, and that is genuinely intended as a question. I have no clue, I must say that preemptively. Rather, I have a real problem. I have a problem with the apparent difference between how generally works of architecture are discussed, and in which grandiose terms they are discussed, and how little and with how little honesty the work of the architect is discussed. And I think there are compelling reasons one should. So very briefly about my book. The book is called Four Walls and a Roof, the Complex Nature of a Simple Profession. It's a deliberately ambiguous title. The book is divided in 7 parts, each of which aims to deal with what I see as a prevailing myth looming over architecture. Authority that speaks for itself, individual inspirations, good causes, professionalism, professional independence, mastery over the large scale, and progress, which in and of themselves are kind of central values to architects, which I guess, like the 7 cardinal virtues in the Bible, in themselves are laudable aspirations, but for anybody who is familiar with the Bible knows that they are intimately linked to their flip sides, the 7 cardinal sins, and that it often takes but the slightest change in temperature, the slightest change in circumstances for a good quality actually to transcend into its bad equivalent. I have an emerging theory that somewhere towards the end of the 20th century, going into the 21st century, such a transition in particularly the context of architecture emerged, which made architecture a very different profession before and after. At first sight, one could say that the 20th century and the 21st century look suspiciously alike. One could say that in many ways so far buildings built in this century are almost like an extra lap of victory for the prototypes of modern architecture of the century before. Some of the prototypes unbuilt in the 20th got built in the 21st. No comment. Here's another one, the Vesnin brothers, Safdie, Richard Meyer in Marseille and Le Corbusier in the United States, Peter Eisenman in Utrecht, Gerrit Rietveld in New Haven, the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe with the beautiful onyx wall and its 21st century equivalent with a rather reduced surface of onyx wall for reasons I guess you can guess. This was the Maison Domino, the prototype launched by Le Corbusier in 1914, fully capitalizing on the possibilities of reinforced concrete. At the time, a relatively new invention. A separation between load-bearing walls and structure, a free facade, etc. And essentially a paradigm that that transformed architecture, created a whole series of liberations for architects to compose. And even that prototype has firmly survived into the 21st century, to the extent that this is probably now the basic principle of about 90% of all buildings that are built. Only this built prototype isn't an architectural statement. I got it of a Greek real estate website which outlines the tax advantages of leaving a building unfinished. And there is a strange situation there, that on the one hand, the moment the prototype is ubiquitous, the moment it has physically triumphed, that strangely seems to be to coincide with its ideological bankruptcy. Architects used to write manifestos quite a lot in the 20th century. At a certain moment, towards the end of the 20th century, the manifestos dried up. I think Prince Charles was the last one to make a decent blueprint, which I think testifies to the death in its own right. And with it, even though modern architecture continues as a style, with it comes the overall rejection of some of its more ambitious models for the city, and also some of its more ambitious social pretension. Pruitt-Igoe in the United States, 1972, demolished 18 years after it was constructed, was by architecture critics heralded in a way as the bankruptcy of modern architecture as a social program, and Pruitt-Igoe was the first in a long range of social housing developments being demolished. I mean, Dublin, Naples, Paris. I mean, I could do this for an incredibly long time. Glasgow, Lyon, Paris again, Glasgow, Frankfurt, and it's gone. And so it is very interesting. We don't write manifestos anymore. A particular type of architecture is, by universal consensus, apparently completely discredited. But when you look at the level of the city, something interesting manifests. Precisely at the moment that architectural manifestos dry up, that is the moment when in other parts of the world the cities in terms of size explode. They grow very, very fast, particularly in East Asia, a stark upward curve over the last 25 years, which often means that the discredited model at us is dusted off, and in a way the scene of the average Chinese real estate office looks like this, suspiciously like the Corbusier model. Simply there are no manifestos, there are no alternatives, there's nothing else to default to when one has to aggressively deal with things that grow fast. This is another one, the city of Ordos. There's something very interesting about that stuff, particularly in China. There is, urbanization has a very strange quality. The top line is the urban income, the bottom line is the rural income. The average urban dweller contributes about 5 times as much to the Chinese economy as the rural dweller. Therefore, if everybody becomes urban, China becomes 5 times as rich. I mean, I have a very limited understanding of economics, but that would be the conclusion. And interestingly enough, what you see, that to some extent real estate is present in every bit of Chinese propaganda under all its leaders, because it is not just the response to a demographic need, it is a manifest sign of economic success and progress, to the point that you don't know, if you look at the graph, whether you're looking at a GDP, at urbanism that grows as a result of GDP, or GDP that grows as a result of urbanism. There's a strange reciprocal relation, almost irrespective of a demographic need. That model, in a way of building yourself up, of building yourself to another economic level, is no longer just prevalent to China. This is a city built by the Chinese. It is in Angola. It was planned as part of a plan of the Angolan government in 2008 to build 1 million homes in the span of merely 4 years. Angola, like Nigeria, has oil. On the basis of an oil-backed loan, China lent Angola huge sums of money, because the World Bank wouldn't, the IMF wouldn't, for reasons of corruption. China lent the money on the condition that the loan would be spent on Chinese contractors, Chinese designers, Chinese firms. So interestingly, oil flew in one direction to China. Money never actually left China, because it was directly paid in China to the Chinese contractors via the bank. So it never even entered the Angolan banking system. So you get an interesting economic flow of oil going in one direction, and then ships with concrete panels going into the other direction, and Chinese laborers, almost a form of very primitive trade. A master plan. Well, I mean, we make things that don't look that dissimilar, I have to admit. The interesting thing is that the mastermind behind getting stuff on the basis of an oil-backed loan without money changing hand was actually this man. It is a French person who is a senior advisor who's wanted in France, but who's a senior advisor to the Angolan government, and who has mastered the trade of changing oil to stuff with an earlier iteration of oil for arms. So the principle is mastered. After peace broke out, simply he was the mastermind actually behind Chinese urbanism entering Angola pretty much on the same terms as the weapons. Well, be that as it may, 2008, welcome, Angolan-Chinese Sino-Angolan partnership at work, with the kind of president's personal involvement in the Chinese leadership. the president personally giving directions. This is a documentary to the urbanism. Also. The city, in a way, as a kind of sign of societal progress, pretty much like we know it from the 1940s and 50s. A city for the young, children in school uniforms, a city for the old, a city with all kinds of appropriate handicapped provisions, a city... What is wrong here? Now, this is actually a thing for an air conditioning unit made to look like an inaccessible balcony, but it's a very without the air conditioning, it's a very unfair slide. So, interestingly, these apartments were meant to be priced between $120,000 and $200,000, with a mortgage system in place, and they were to cater to the new Angolan middle class, which would emerge as a result of oil wealth. Then the price of oil plummeted. So there was no middle class. The apartments stayed the same price, but this was the amount of money that the people had to continue to get by on. So the city, much to the delight of the BBC, CNN, remained empty, who sort of, in a way, broadcasted the whole Chinese cock-up. Revealed that these people in these films were actually actors hired to make the city look populated, and cast footage of a city which stretched miles and miles and miles, which was completely empty, without a single car on the road, no car in parks, all shutters shut, not a single air conditioning unit on any of these things, which was in a way the giveaway sign that they truly were empty. And that was the thing. So there is a town of about 1 million homes that for a long time stood completely empty, almost like a Corbusian model, built at a live scale, and a utopia executed, but no people. There you have it. Slowly but surely, the favelas, or musecas they're called in Angola, re-emerged on the fringe of that city. Israeli security guards patrol the area night and day to keep squatters out, and so that's a very ironic thing, that in a way the stuff that they were meant to get rid of, that's where people live, there nobody lives, and it's a very weird contrast. It's a contrast that by and large is symptomatic for the capital of Angola as a whole. There is a very rich downtown with extortionate property prices, escalating real estate boom, and there is a kind of whole ring of shanty towns encircling it. And it highlights a curious paradox, that while Angola is probably one of the poorest nations on earth, it has the capital with the highest cost of living on earth. And that's, to me, when things like that happen, my understanding of economy completely breaks down. So that's dilemma one. So there are these types of development in China. There are these types of development in Africa. The only thing is that since the crisis of 2008, we did a little bit of research, and by now the phenomena of vacant real estate at a vast scale is no longer a Chinese or an African phenomena. It's a global phenomenon. We found a list of 100 examples with really shocking vacancies for a very, very long time. There is stuff like that since the crisis in Spain. This is a residential development near Madrid, planned on a high-speed rail that never came, which stands completely empty. This is another one, kind of half-finished, with a pristine road network, all the way finished, kind of totally surrealist mise-en-scène, where the announcement of the city is the kind of biggest architectural masterpiece in the whole thing. In Torino, there is stuff like this in Ireland, which almost looks like a model photographed by a very good photographer, making it look real. Another Irish one, stuff on the Belgian coast, and this stuff. This is, for me, an interesting given. So the one thing is, it's not exotic, it is actually next door. What this image serves to show, this is a Herzog and Demeron building in Beirut. So it's also done with the full complicity of our colleagues, and perhaps even sometimes we ourselves. These are two buildings in Beirut. This is the former Holiday Inn, completed in the late 70s, never used because the Civil War broke out and it was a bastion of snipers. Whoever controlled the high-rises controlled the city. Numerous redevelopment efforts have taken place since, but it's remained a trauma in the city. This is a building of about the same size, in white concrete, same modernistic style. It's also empty. But it's not a trauma, it's actually a triumph, because every apartment in it has been sold at a record price. There's just nobody living there. But as long as the apartments can be traded for more money than they were constructed or bought, it actually perpetuates an economic cycle. And that leads to some very schizophrenic reactions to the building. I mean, you can judge it as a piece of architecture or as a piece of development, which the property press does. And then you get the typical cliches like world-class icons, vibrant cities. I mean, this could be a British planning application. While the local press actually scathes about the whole thing as an unwelcome intrusion in the city, which drives up prices and causes ordinary Beirutis to live ever further away from the city. And for me, the example, and I guess numerous examples are possible, is very interesting, because it just shows that modern architecture from one century to the other, even though stylistically reminiscent and similar to the previous iteration, is economically, essentially, it has changed sides. This is a book which I always talk about. It's capital in the point of this is also that, so on architectural terms, it is very hard to explain the difference. You almost have to go into the economics behind those buildings to appreciate in full how much the role of modern architecture has changed. This is a book by Thomas Piketty. Piketty is a French economist, and what he has done is that for a period of more than 2 millennia, he has compared two economic categories. He has essentially compared the return on labor to the return on capital. Very simply, how much money do you make from working? How much money do you make from having things? Money, for instance. And he argues that as soon as an economic situation arises where you make more from possessions than you do from working, there is no chance for the working classes ever to catch up, to emancipate, because they get richer, but people who have things get even richer. So the divide pertains. And he's, in a way, arguing that we are, in the 21st century, entering such a system where essentially it is no longer possible to work your way up. Inherited wealth plays an important role, and you see it happening. The global value of real estate is this, the global GDP is that. So already the combined body of all buildings in the world represents a larger economic category than all labor in the world. So anyway, he's analysed it. So we're towards the same moment that the Manifestos stop. I don't think there's a causal relation there, but I do think it's an interesting coincidence that, to some extent, the history of architecture becomes much easier to explain once you compare it see it as a function of the economy rather than a kind of art historic perspective. So we all, I guess, see the consequences of that. This is in the Netherlands. Record prices. This is in Amsterdam. People overbidding, driving up the price even further. A lot of building going on. Apparently a massive housing shortage is quoted all the time from the building economy, while our population is a beacon of stability. So it's hard to figure out a demographic necessity. Most of the existing real estate in the Netherlands is relatively new, so an expiration date of building also isn't a reason. In fact, the older the building, the higher the value. What you find is that, so this is then the category with the highest value, what you find is that most of the houses are bought to be rented, not to be lived in, and a vast amount of the homes, in 2017 was a record of all time, an enormous amount of homes were bought by foreign investors in a global system where interest rate, I mean, in Japan they're even negative. In the Netherlands you get 0.2%, even on large amounts of money in the bank. So with no interest rate, money looks for a way to return. Money looks for a return. So the shortage is not a demographic given. It's not people looking for a home, it's money looking for a home. And that is a very interesting brief for architects because it has significant consequences. And I would like to look at a few of these consequences. So this happens everywhere. Vienna, 10% for sale, mostly from Russia and UK. This is in London, where you have your fair share of that stuff. Australia, Manhattan, Vancouver, where prices are driven up, also houses bought by Shell Company. But the interesting thing is that real estate speculation is creating a kind of upmarket migration of people changing address simply to be able to invest in real estate. And what is striking is that some of the most xenophobic, anti-migrant, fascist countries present in the European Union, like Hungary, is actually offering people investment opportunities in real estate in exchange for a passport. So this is the country that massively categorically refuses to house any refugees from Syria or whatever, but the same country that actively solicits rich people from those same countries to come there and invest money. There is such a thing as billionaire migrant. It is a new category. 2004, the global rich man has made 2 billion acquiring nationalities. This is Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch. He became a Cypriot. This is Rami Makhlouf, businessman from Syria. He became an Austrian. This is Manuel Vicente, the vice president of Angola. He sort of joined the ranks of its former colonizer. And this is Paul Titt, the co-founder of PayPal, who became a New Zealander of all places. There is on the internet even a ranking on the best countries to buy citizenship, which is related to investment opportunities for real estate. So a number of effects. This is in Amsterdam, 16.2 million for an apartment by a Chinese chef, Chinese businessman, I believe. In the Netherlands, until recently, that was an unheard of amount. In fact, there is a much bigger amount, although in a penthouse in New York. 160 million pounds by Nick Candy, who actually bought an apartment from himself in Hyde Park Corner, merely to drive up the price. But this is a little bit like the transfer of Neymar. That's for 225 million euros, and in the wake of that, some pretty mediocre football players also get sold for records amount. A kind of a self-perpetuating craziness. The CEO, a record currently set in New York for 100 million in the Vignoli Tower. Now, something very interesting is going on. This is the Vignoli Tower. You have light at eerily, regularly dispersed intervals in the night. And those are not apartments, those are actually lit plant rooms, which happen every so often. The rest is dark. So the plant rooms are lit to suggest inhabitation, the rest is for sale. This is a building that by and large stands empty, the interior of one of the apartments. And inasmuch it is owned by people who invest money, but judging from the interior, don't actually live there. Another one, I mean, this is an interior that's a show interior. You clearly see, I mean, Jennifer Lopez, and Alex Rodriguez, who co-own a bed that doesn't look like it's slept in ever. So the thing is interesting. That's a particular typology. It's a typology mostly of one apartment per floor. So if it's not lived in, you normally notice that you have an absent neighbor. But if you have one apartment per floor, you have no absent neighbor. So it's the perfect typology to kind of be a showcase of showroom apartments, and you simply wouldn't know. It's very tall, and they're getting taller, so there is a very distorting effect. I think many structural engineers would struggle with a thing like that, and it defies the whole notion of healthy proportions, to the point that you can make the following assumption. What is a building that doesn't get lived in more than actually a concrete sculpture? It doesn't, theoretically, when it's not lived in, it doesn't. The use is merely an alibi, and it doesn't really need to correspond to use. It is a concrete piggyback where there's money. So that was the kind of thing that the apotheosis of that type of architecture is a form of macro sculpture of which you can buy apart to see this. And if you think that is far-fetched, I have a number of examples of buildings where the function is really nothing but an alibi to build the building. This is the monument of the Constitution, a building in a Central Asian dictatorship, so there's probably no constitution, but there is a monument. Same city, the home of the world's largest Ferris wheel, the Palace of Happiness, the House of Free Creativity, in a place where probably only free creativity is on behalf of that man. It's another huge ghost town, and not even a ghost town, but an uninhabited city. One that has never been lived in, one where in a way it's been built but nobody lives there. It's the largest collection of white Italian marble, gilded domes, but on the whole the city is as empty as the African example I showed. The homes are empty, there's a transport system in place, everything works, but there's also no driver because it's a driverless train, so it's a completely automated concrete machine in the middle of the steppe. A very curious example. Now again here, the weird thing is that last slide wasn't Ashgabat, it was Vancouver. And we've noticed a particularly strange thing. You have these lists for the most livable cities, generally to determine expat wages. And there's the criteria of livability. But we found that the most livable cities, according to that index, are also the city with the highest vacancy rate of apartments. So a city is particularly livable when people don't live there. And cities where nobody lives are invariably into this very fashionable terms. They're into placemaking, where in a way a whole series of kind of semi-imbecile, infantile activities and parades compensate probably for a huge amount of vacancy. In the background, this is the same list: Calgary, Sydney, Vancouver, and here Toronto. Again, kind of infantile activities in front of largely empty office spaces, and this has pervaded the jargon of property developers in no uncertain term as something good. Placemaking is an innate ability that we all have, and I would say indeed, because this is the type of placemaking and the type of public space that probably things are about. More about this later. The most livable cities are invariably the cities, rich cities, with a very high average salaries. They're also expensive cities when it comes to real estate, and very often they are expensive cities before they are rich cities. The expensiveness of real estate outpaces the growth of wage. You could say this is a sum carried out that if for a house to buy, the limit of an affordable house is 2.5 times your annual wage. That is a loan from the bank, and that's when something qualifies as affordable. So let's do the math. 2.5 times the average salary, average divided by average price per square meter, gives you how much? This is what you can buy as an affordable apartment size in those cities. The more livable, the more cramped the conditions, almost invariably. This is 15 square meters. This is 15 square meters with a person in it. And this is how 15 square meters compares to a number of spaces. So it's almost twice the size of a maximum security cell at Barwon Prison. It's a little bigger than the smallest new Jayco caravan. It's about the size of a parking lot, and it's a micro-flat apartment. It's in any case, and that's interesting, it's smaller than what was designed as the absolute existence minimum by the communist system shortly after the revolution. So in a way, we've traded down. Container is about 15 square meters, so container apartments are very prevalent, very fashionable, probably for very good reason. And this, for me, is the irony at all. That we have got the market economy. Supposedly, we're a lot richer than in the 20th century, but we have traded down. We've traded down. This was anyway, I think, a replica for some sort of exhibition, but nevertheless, the picture is. The effect is good. That in a way we're on the verge of kind of getting ever less for ever more money. The development of medium income since the 1950, the willingness of the bank to provide a mortgage on the basis of that minimum income, sort of steadily up in good times, then after a fall, then back up again. But this is, in final instance, the comparison of what house prices have done, which means that no matter, there's almost no amount you are allowed to loan to afford it, and even that, in a way, with pinpoint accuracy, falls within that moment of the before and after, and the commitment, I think, of large groups of architects to that thing. So the question is, what is to be done? This is a kind of an overt confession to Marxist Leninism. What structural changes are possible to, in a way, turn around that trend? What is if in a way the communist revolution was about capital? What is the largest category of capital in the world today? And that turns out to be real estate. It's bigger than oil reserves, gold, global GDP, bigger than anything else. And the vast majority of it is residential development. Even if you would take away any other form of real estate, it still is by far the largest asset class in the whole financial system. How does that work? This is the gherkin. You all know what this is. The gherkin has been in existence for about 15 years. In the course of those years, it changed hands once, it changed hands twice. But in the course of changing hands, it went from about 300 million to build to a net worth of almost $1 billion, which is fast. Now, these were the total cost. We did a bit of a breakdown of what those costs were divided on, and we made a guesstimate of what Foster earned. Foster is a good architect, probably an even better negotiator. So let's say he got about 5% of the whole thing. That means that his fee, his total architect's fee on building that building would have been about £7 million. The increase in value of the building itself was £720 million, which is about 100 times the fee of an architect, which I think is an interesting comparison. It's in a way, I came across this quote. It's only after men have raised themselves above the rank of animals, when their labour has been socialised, that a state arises in which the surplus labour of the one becomes a condition of existence for the other. That seems to apply perfectly in the case of real estate, and of course this quote is by Marx. Anyway, architecture or revolution. When I grew up, I always wanted to be two things. I very much wanted to be an architect, and I very much wanted to be a revolutionary. And I had some lingering hope that the two ambitions could be combined until I started to practice as an architect, and I realized that there was no hope in hell that those could be combined. So what kind of revolution could one imagine in architecture itself to somehow address this kind of vicious cycle that it seems to be part of? We looked at this is a diagram of Vitruvius, the Roman architect. Firmitas utilitas venustas, durability durability, practicality, and beauty, and that's the ethos, I would argue, that has survived throughout the centuries. Alberti talks about the internal values of architecture. Ruskin talks about building for multiple generations, and even a contemporary icon as Frank Gehry speaks of the timelessness of architecture. You can wonder how true that is, because if you look at the average lifespan of buildings that have been built over the course of the centuries, 300 years in 1500, that was 150 years, 100 years, you feel where this is going. 50 years buildings from the 16th, some of our own stuff doesn't even make it beyond 25 years. So one could imagine a future where the lifespan of a building is actually negative. And what I mean to say with that is that rather than planning the construction of a building, you have to plan its demolition. That already as part of building a building, you have to plan its demolition, which would in a way revolutionize these qualities into their Latin antonyms, which would mean that something is temporary, it is flexible, and it is discrete, which means that the classical ideal would be replaced by that. That the main merits of a building is how easily you can take it away, how little loyalty it has to place, and how much you can use it for what it was not intended. That is the new ethos of truly modern architecture. There is a generation of building actually in the 20th century, and an example that is quite interesting. This is an East German prefabricated housing estate. All of those were built according to a complete catalogue of prefabricated parts, which actually means that interestingly, that its demolition is the same as its construction, but the film is just played back to front. In other words, you end up with the same spare parts that once went into the building. You can transport those spare parts, you can adapt those spare parts, and you can translate these spare parts into a new architecture. This is the cover of my book. The joke is that this seems to be a very classical 19th century home, but that this is entirely made out of recycled concrete panels from these kind of socialist housing estates with a thick layer of stucco, a pitch roof, and one would simply never know. If you can recycle buildings, you might be able to move buildings. In fact, you could move entire churches. If you're in the business of moving buildings, why distinguish between a building and the vehicle of transport? A building as a truck, building as a ship, a kind of walking house, or entire cities could walk. Why is that interesting? One may wonder. This is a difficult one to explain. The Dutch word for real estate is vastgoed. The German word is Immobilien. Vastgoed, goed is stuff, vast is fixed. In other words, it's stuff that doesn't move. That's real estate. Once you can move it, it's no longer vastgoed, it is Lossfoot. It's stuff that is loose, stuff that you can move. And there might be some interesting implications of that. I referred earlier to the Yellow Vests in Paris. They have a precursor, much of it has a precursor in the 1960s with big protests, which in one way or another were always invariably in Amsterdam, in Germany, were often against unfair real estate speculation in the city. One big protagonist of the Green Movement in Germany even called at the time for the fact that, like air, one shouldn't be able to own land. That land is a communal commodity just like air, that it's immoral to own it. Once that happens, once there is, and he had a whole legal proposal to, in a way, separate the ownership of buildings to the ownership of land, which means that it's the effect of the Lossfoot by law. The interesting thing is, once that happens, a building actually starts to suffer the same cycle of economic depreciation as any other product. So Foster goes in reverse, and a particularly horrible class of people can no longer make a living, and there we are. The last propositional bit is a slight provocation, but the dilemmas which triggered it are no less real. That's it.